Good afternoon, and welcome to this third event for the Manhattan Institute's new initiative on policing and public safety. I am this project's director, Hannah Myers. There is no louder word on everyone's lips today when it comes to policing than reform. But reform comes in so many different shapes and sizes. How do we know which model is best for any given jurisdiction or department? Today, we will be focusing on two distinctly different models for reform. Camden, New Jersey, where there was a complete overhaul of the police department under state and local authority, and Baltimore, Maryland, where a federally mandated monitorship came in to oversee change. We are so lucky to be joined by practitioners who were on the ground in both locations, designing and implementing these reforms, as well as experts to talk about the role and reform of police unions, financial crisis, crime stats, and so much more. So without further ado, I am delighted to introduce our moderator today, Peter Moskos.
Hi, thanks, Hannah.
Sure.
It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion this hour. Allow me to introduce the panelists, the discussant.
Peter, let me introduce you.
Oh, yes, please do.
Peter
I do need an introduction.
And you deserve one. He is the professor and chair of the Department of Law, Police and Science, and Criminal Justice Administration at John Jay College of Criminal Justice right here in New York City, as well as the director of John Jay's NYPD Executive Master's Program. And he is also himself a former Baltimore City police officer. He holds a PhD and master's from Harvard, as well as a bachelor's from Princeton, all in sociology, and has received wide acclaim for his 3 books, Cop in the Hood, In Defense of Flogging, and Greek Americans. And if you really want to grapple with police stats and crime stats, then his blog, copinthehood.com, is a must-read. Peter Moskos, please.
Thank you. That was very kind of you. So the panelists that we have today that you lined up so skillfully, we have retired Chief J. Scott Thomson. He managed the overhaul and heralded transformation of the Camden City Police Department that became the Camden County Police Department for the city of Camden, New Jersey. Stephen Ida is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor of City Journal. Ganesha Martin led the implementation team for the structural reforms at the Baltimore City Police Department as the chief of the Department of Justice Compliance and Accountability External Affairs. And Daniel DeSalvo is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a professor of political science at the Colin Powell School at the City College of New York, my fellow CUNY college. So thank you all for being here and attending. And I'd like to start with Ganesha, if I could. The general topic of reform. I figure you have some ideas what it means. It's a term that is bandied about quite a lot, even more so recently. And sometimes I worry that it's become a sort of meaningless term as just change for change's sake. So how do you define reform? How can we measure success? What are the lessons that you have learned from your experience in Baltimore?
Yeah, Peter, that's a great question. And I do think one of the most unfortunate pieces of reform is that people politicize it for their own good. And that tends to leave out the needs of the police that, put on a uniform every day and put their lives on the line to protect and to serve communities. And then it leaves out generally, oppressed Black and brown communities who need the police, just need them to act constitutionally. And so, to me, reform has become bastardized, similar to community policing, right? And so for me, what reform really means is to get in there, to talk to the police who are on the front lines every day, to talk to the community and hear them fully. Give them a space to talk about how they don't have the equipment, how they don't feel legitimacy in their police department, that they'll be dealt with fairly in the disciplinary scenario, that they don't have the right training, that they don't have the right equipment, that, within the police ranks, there's cliques and, they don't feel supported for a variety of different reasons. Then go talk to community who have watched their brothers, their sisters, their fathers be, victims of excessive force, unnecessary uses of force. And so really hear those folks out from the beginning, and then align what you've heard with them with policy, with training, with equipment, with technology. Nobody wants to talk about technology. It is key to reform. And align those things so that the policies and the training that come about serve the police, give them the wherewithal and the skills that they need to do this difficult job, but to redress sometimes what is unconstitutional and brutal treatment that they receive from some police officers. Make sure those things align, and I don't think that that's happening in a lot of places, but that's how I see reform, Peter.
What surprised you? What do you know now that you did not expect to know a few years ago?
Well, you know what's funny? And I'm sure we'll get to this, but the unions play such a role, in this toxic sometimes conversation. And it was funny when I left the police department, and I did it because the mayor there fired the police chief who, really believed in forcing and pushing reform forward. And I left the day after that happened. But I got a call from the union president who said, hey, Ganesha, because it's sometimes, he thought I was a casualty of the war. And he says, hey, Ganesha, I can get your job back. I can get your job back. And I said, you know what? It's really funny that you're calling me, right? I mean, I was the reform person. I was this, the consent decree, horrible thing that was coming down on the department. And he said, you know what? We know you did it with the cops in mind. And when I had the community called me and said the same thing, we need you back. And I listened to them. And one of the first things that I did, again, with technology, I used the consent decree to get, MDCs, computers in cars, 8th largest police department in the United States. And we were still writing everything. Most of our violence was retaliatory. So you get an email 2 days later that somebody else might be, getting shot, and 12 people have already been shot since then. You want police to reduce violence, but, that's what you give them. You want to know if they're disproportionately stopping African-American males on the midnight shift, and all of the stop tickets are in a box. And so, the first thing I did was use the consent decree to actually, give the men and women the tools that they need to serve the community. And so, that the technology, and now granted, the union didn't go on Twitter or on TV and say they supported me, but, it was something that we talked about. And so, those two things, how important technology is to reform, and how far you can really get when you do legitimately listen to both the police and the community in reform, I think was surprising to me. The last thing that I would say, and it shouldn't have been surprising, but just how much the politics of all of those pots, the politics in police departments, the politics in the Department of Justice, the politics of community. If you don't have somebody in the middle of that really trying to work through all that reform, no matter what, how many good things you want to accomplish, will go to the wayside, because people are using both the police and the community as a political football.
Interesting. Let me then move over to Daniel, because you mentioned the importance of police unions. And I always like to mention their police unions and their police unions. They often get lumped together. But I mean, from what I see, the PBA in New York behaves very differently than the FOP, and those are the two big national organizations for policing. The PBA in New York behaves very differently than the FOP in Baltimore. But the FOP, not without faults, but generally has a more constructive attitude. They release position papers and policies. They don't just yell mean things to the mayor on Twitter, for instance. Daniel, you've studied police unions a lot. You've written about police unions. If you could wave a magic wand, first of all, would you eliminate police unions? And if so, how would that would that help policing?
Well, I don't. No one's going to be giving me the magic wand, so I think I'll probably start a little closer to the tough realities. And just, I think the first thing to understand is that police unions in states where there's collective bargaining are really doing something that is fundamental to structuring police departments, which is to say the union, through its collective bargaining activities, shapes the organization of the police department. That is, it shapes the rights of management, the rights of labor, what are all of the grievance processes, arbitration. So really the whole structure of the bureaucracy starts at the collective bargaining table and is shaped in part by that. It's also shaped by police unions structuring things from the top down, which is to say through their political activity, trying to elect favorable candidates, lobbying and electioneering. So in that sense, you have to start out with how much the union itself is intertwined with just the basic structure of the organization. So that's I think the most important thing to start out with. Obviously, there's negotiation over pay and benefits as well as subjects of collective bargaining, but that's not been the subject of recent controversy. The subject of recent controversy is how much the police unions are shaping the disciplinary procedures and making it more difficult to either discipline, retrain, or reassign, or ultimately even fire bad cops or cops who end up doing things that harm citizens.
Is there any data or evidence that shows that at-will police departments, and I assume they're mostly at South where they do not have union protection, do we see any demonstrably better behavior or less worse behavior among police officers there?
Well, this is a great research question. The truth is that police unions, in terms of academic study, have been very neglected, really neglected topics. We don't have a ton of data or good studies, empirical studies that would look at questions like that, making those kinds of comparisons that our federal system really allows for. So while it's a terrific question, the truth is we don't know, in part because police unions, to the extent they've been studied, have primarily been studied by law professors who are interested in issues related to labor relations and so on, not to these kind of tough empirical questions. The truth is very few departments, as far as I know, are truly at-will departments where there are not a set of protections that go beyond the normal, what would be seen in, say, a corporate environment where one could be fired at any time for any reason. So one would really have to dig into the details of those sorts of situations.
Maybe this is a good time to ask a man who's dealt personally with police unions. Scott Thomson was the key to the restructuring of the Camden department, which, to give a brief background, and you please correct me where I'm wrong, but in May of 2013, the city police department of Camden, New Jersey was abolished and was restructured as the county police department, which only polices Camden City as far as I know. Now, cynically, and I say this as a union member, it was criticized as Republican union busting in part. The new police department, and you ran both the old and the new, which is also an interesting part of a reform movement when the police chief stays the same. But can you tell us what happened and I get maybe specifically, but briefly, the role of the union, but I'd like to get more into the broad story of Camden a little bit because it's often held up now as a potential model for other police departments.
Mm-hmm. Well, Peter, first of all, it's an honor to be on here with you and our fellow guests here today. And so I'll start first with the answer and a reply to the union question. You know, my experiences with our police union are very Dickens-esque. I had the best of times and I had the worst of times. When I first became police chief in the city police department, I had a fraternal order of police, and I mention it because we continued to be a fraternal order of police in the new organization that was very recalcitrant. I think in my first 6 months as police chief, I had more than 100 grievances filed against me. I had about 8 lawsuits filed against me. It was anything that was challenging or altering the status quo was immediately litigated. And fast forward to several years later when I had the opportunity to create a new police department, and New Jersey is a state in which people can organize, and the police officers did, and they selected to go with an FOP again, but this time under different leadership. Same organization, different leadership. And my experiences with the Camden County FOP, that again was just for our organization, was that they were they were tremendous facilitators in what we were looking to achieve. Is they essentially became, they deviated significantly away from being the defense attorneys for bad cops, if you will. In fact, there were oftentimes that when I would go to them with discipline, they were looking to hold their officers to just as high, if not even a higher standard. They did not want lazy, apathetic, corrupt police officers, and they were pretty vociferous with that amongst their membership as well. And from a leadership perspective, that was a very catalytic to us being able to establish the culture we wanted.
Do you know roughly what percentage of the cops applied and were not hired back in the new department? Because one of the, I mean, I think this will go for any organization, but I think the consequences are greater in policing. If you can get rid of the bottom, 5 or 10%, you might accomplish a great deal of good. How many, because I know a lot of cops were hired back, but how many weren't?
Yeah, and that's a great question. We were down right before we laid everybody off, including myself. We were down to about 200 police officers, and about 150 of the 200 applied, and about 145 got hired. The only ones that didn't get hired were ones that were precluded because of ongoing criminal investigations or things of that nature. So, if you were to ask me at the time, if I was to cherry pick and say, there's 50 people that you don't want to come over into this organization, who are those 50? Those folks self-selected, and they were really the hardcore union folks who were trying to convince everyone else to not apply for the job so that the new organization wouldn't be able to be created. And invariably, they ended up just self-selecting themselves out of the process, which ironically, they all became each other's competition for other police jobs in the region. But not having probably the hardest core of the recalcitrant individuals coming over into the new organization, that was certainly beneficial from a leadership perspective of being able to hit the reset button to go new. But we did have people that came over that had pending litigation that were not happy about having to apply for a new job and move over. But the vast majority of them quickly caught on to the new culture because it was you were going to go with the flow of the organization or you weren't going to stay afloat much longer.
Let me put on a little graphic, if I could, that shows that I made it. I'm sorry. There it goes. It shows the arrests and the murders in Camden over time from 2008 to this year estimated. And that little vertical line is when the new police department set up. The red line are murders and the blue bars are the number of arrests in any given year. And there's, with the exception of 1 year, since the new department's taken over, the murder, violence has gone down. But there was initial increase in arrests, and then that also has gone down. Can you talk about how this, what's behind these numbers?
Well, I appreciate that graph you have there. And one thing I think that's interesting to note in that graph is when you look at 2011 and 2012, those were the periods wherein there was a de facto defunding of the police, right? We had in 2011, January 2011, 46% of the organization was laid off in one day. And you could see the impact that had on our ability to keep the community secure. Mentor of mine, Bill Bratton, George Kelling say it best when they say that cops count and police matter, particularly in extremely destabilized neighborhoods. But then our staffing levels did not start to get back to where we needed to be effective until 2013, 2014, and 2015. Now, when you start to look at the arrests, what you're seeing is an increase in activity. This was the point in time when we were doing very high levels of community engagement. We were becoming more effective because we were getting more intelligence from the community on who were the small percentage of people that were really negatively defining everyone else's life. But I will tell you that and we learned this from the community, that in the first couple of years, the community was let us know that our very high levels of enforcement were not endearing to them. They appreciated the fact that there was now engagement and contact that was not just simply predicated upon enforcement or crisis. They appreciated the community policing, but that we were still engaging in very high levels of arresting members of the community. So we had to recalibrate. We had to look at what we were doing and how we were doing it so that we would start to put a laser-like focus on the individuals who were really most important, the people that were influencing the violence within communities. And when you have the relationship with the communities and you're getting that type of information, we as an organization became far more effective. We saw our murder solve rates go from 16% to 61%. So as we did very strong levels of enforcement very early on, but then we walked it backwards. And a lot of this was lessons we learned from other jurisdictions that we took a lot of the ideology and strategies and tactics from. But again, we regulated our dosages that we were doing on the community. And once we were able to really get those people that were negatively defined in everybody's life removed from the streets, we didn't need to be as enforcement minded or as arrest minded as possible. So we were able to continue to have progress and sustainability in keeping violence down, but also lowering our outputs in the terms of summonses and arrests.
There's what amazed me when I looked at this just the other day in preparation for this talk is that Camden, which is a historically violent city, this year is an estimate, but the murder rate compared to Philadelphia across the river, they're converging this year. It looks like Philadelphia may actually be higher at the end of the year. And I like to compare these two cities. Of course, Philadelphia is much larger, and you don't want to take those comparisons too far. But I mention this because presumably the root causes that people talk about behind crime, the poverty, the unemployment, the racism, have not changed dramatically and improved in Camden while getting worse in Philadelphia. And yet policing can actually work. The fact that you have divergent trends in these two cities means something important there is going on. That is an interest, and you saw these same trends, by the way, in New York with crime and arrests going down. You saw it in Baltimore until 2015 with violence and arrests going down. That to me is kind of the win-win situation. Let me switch the focus slightly, if I could. I want to bring Stephen into the conversation because an essential part of an essential part of reform, but it goes beyond reform. And I'm talking about police dealing with people in mental crisis. I'm talking about de-escalation. If you look at situations of police use of lethal force and non-lethal force, what always jumps out is the issue of mental health. How can police better deal with this? And is there a better alternative to police?
Yeah, well, the question of de-escalation training, which is what a lot of these debates center around, and really it stems from this problem that we have very high levels of contact between the mentally ill people and the criminal justice system in general. Both patrol officers on the street, but also jails and prisons, the court system. And so de-escalation training is something that people have proposed as a way to especially bring down the number of mental illness related police shootings, police fatalities. According to the Washington Post database, which is the best resource to look at for these things, probably 20 to 25% of fatal police shootings somehow involve mental illness. The question really is how much de-escalation training can reduce that rate, reduce those shootings, say 200 to 250 per year. The number is clearly not zero. At the same time, there are a lot of incidents where we do need to be thinking about sort of social service type or more upstream type reforms. If you take, for example, the tragedy that happened last month in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where you had a person with untreated serious mental illness who attacked a cop with a knife and was tragically shot to death. De-escalation is the wrong answer to that question. We need to have a debate about how to prevent those types of tragedies, but is de-escalation really the answer to that? I think what the value of de-escalation for me lies in, frankly, owning the idea of police work as social work. Instead of trying to separate these two service systems of mental health care / social services and public safety, trying to kind of thread them together, but in the right way. And that's as a result, not just to provide this training, which in a quality de-escalation, a quality crisis intervention team program can reduce those incidents, but also the criminal justice system and police departments have to be part of this discussion about mental health reform. If what we're talking about is not just problems with police departments, but really problems with mental health departments, which is why we have so many of these interactions, then we need to have people who are experienced in dealing with people with serious mentally ill and in that discussion. And that's patrol officers who work in Midtown Manhattan, people who work in jails and prisons, and people who work in the courts. A lot of people who work in mental health service providers don't have as much experience with dealing with people with violent tendencies who have schizophrenia. And so really, I think de-escalation training done right, this may sound trite, but it's kind of a win-win. It's good for police departments, but it's really essential if we want to have a debate about mental health care reform, which is ultimately what we need to be doing if we want to prevent these grisly incidents.
And some of that relates to the current talk about defund. And one of my problems with the defund concept is, yes, we need better services. We need better mental health treatment, care, prevention. But the idea that somehow cutting a police budget is going to improve that, I don't quite see the cause and effect there. Last week in the George Kelling talk that the Manhattan Institute put on, former Commissioner Bratton mentioned that the New York Police Department responds to something, and I could be wrong about this number, but I think it's 300,000 calls for emotionally disturbed people each year. To have mental health people respond to those calls, or at least the ones they could respond to, this is not a small incremental change. It would be a fundamental change that would require, more money, if nothing else. Ganesha, do you have any thoughts on this on the defund movement?
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's just been politicized. If you actually set down police, at the table with the folks who want to truly get to the heart of the defund movement, they would say, yeah, we've been saying this forever. We show up to, when you guys call us constantly and tell us that we need to move along the homeless folks, we show up with guns, we show up with badges, we show up with tasers. We don't show up with anything that can actually serve those individuals, but yet we're the ones that are asked to respond. When you in Baltimore, when we tried to put together the best practice, a co-responder model, I had to go beg and borrow from foundations to pay for it. And it lasted a good 2 years, and then, nobody would fund it. And so, the one thing that folks aren't talking about enough, you can get into the line items of police budgets, but most of the time, they're 85 up to 90%, paying salaries and pensions. And so when we talk about taking money, from them, what we really should be talking about is, do we want them to, better function? But the other thing that's being left out of this conversation is the reason why we have so many people that are suffering from mental health issues on the streets in our criminal justice system is the lack of resources and responsiveness. We talk about, systemic racism and policing. Those same issues exist in social services and all of these places we want to take money from, and then, take money from the police and then give it to people who actually haven't proven that what they're doing is working in the first place. And at the end of the day, Black and brown people will continue to be the victims of that, and then the police will continue to get blamed, because what's going to happen when that situation unravels and somebody is, becomes, violent, then the police are going to still come. And I applaud, a lot of departments, including even Baltimore City, and, having the certification of CIT, additional 40 hours of training, making sure that the training is part of in-service and new recruit training. But there are people that have, degrees, in this stuff. And we're asking police to do this on top of everything else. And so I think it's a lot. And so, if we actually stop kind of, again, I hate to overuse this, but kind of hurling this back and forth as a political football and actually sit down and look at the system in totality and how governments spend their money in the first place. There's a reallocation that probably needs to happen, but it's not simply just taken from police and given to other agencies.
The last time I was in Baltimore on a ride along in my old haunts in the Eastern District, the officer I was riding with, I asked him I said, have you ever received in-service training you actually liked, that you thought was productive, that you thought was helpful? Because cops are notoriously hostile to having to sit in a room and get lectured at for 8 hours. And he said city training was great, crisis intervention training. And that surprised me. And he said, no, I've heard that it's not just a case study of one. It's not a formal study, but I hear this time and time again. I hear it in New York a lot too, that it gives officers a different perspective on how to deal with people that they're already dealing with. And he found it incredibly useful. And, frankly, I found it surprising. Maybe you don't find that surprising, but I did.
Well, Peter, just on that note, though, we hired somebody specifically that was her background. And she stayed at the academy. She stayed around for questions. She was there. So it wasn't, what happens oftentimes in police departments. We take police officers with a couple of years on. You say, you're smart, you're good at administration, go teach this class. That's not serving police. So I think at least in part, part of why it was good in Baltimore is because we had the right person to teach our police officers. We made that investment.
Yeah, and just to highlight something about the question of defund and resources and quality CIT training, at some level, it's just a question of personnel. These calls take a long time to resolve. Are you okay with patrol officers taking 2 or 3 hours to resolve a situation with a person of crisis, if that's how long it takes? Are you okay with patrol officers going off to check in on people who they had helped months before instead of responding to 911 calls? A CIT program does not necessarily itself, the training does not necessarily have to be expensive, but you need to have enough personnel, enough cops to commit to doing these calls. And that's where, you might get into a dangerous situation if you're cutting police departments willy-nilly, where a department may not be able to do the program in a quality way, even if it wants to do it.
Yeah, the zero-sum world or approach bothers me, and Ganesha, you pointed it out, and it's worth reemphasizing that so much of the budget is labor, and you simply can't cut a police department budget easily. I mean, especially if you don't talk to the police department. It's one thing if you said in 5 years we'd like to cut your funds 20%, let's figure out how to get there. But right now what we've seen are more vindictive cuts simply to punish police departments. There is a question. Go ahead. Oh, there's a question from Michael who's watching this. Or I'm sorry, from Amelia, who's watching this. How instructive are cross-national comparisons? We hear about different approaches in different countries. I should mention one of the big differences is our guns. It's Western Europe does a lot of things right, but it's a very different approach to policing if you assume someone doesn't have a gun on them. But what can we learn from places in Western Europe or Asia or anywhere, or Africa?
Well, Peter, I'll tell you, from 2015 to 2019, I was the president of the Police Executive Research Forum, which we have more than 3,000 members internationally, and we had published in 2015 a document, the Perf 30, Reengineering the Use of Force, and a lot of this was based off of what Stephen said earlier with regards to. When you look at the amount of officer-involved shootings each and every year, it's roughly about 1,000. And it's close to, like you said, about 25% to 30% are shootings of individuals that are not armed with a gun. So if we just take out those that have guns, and we just look at the 300 or so a year where there's fatal involved shootings with officers that are people that don't have guns. and we look at our European brethren and how they approach situations with people with edged weapons and the like, there were lessons to be learned from that. And there were some really good takeaways that we learned from Police Scotland when we went and spent time over there. And because, a person that's mentally ill, and most of your edge weapons, in particularly when you're dealing with urban environments, are mentally ill generally do not have guns. Most of the mentally ill are going to be armed with an edge weapon or a blunt object. And what, a person with a mental illness and a knife standing at the corner of 57th and 10th in New York City is not much different than a person who's mentally ill standing on a corner in Glasgow, Scotland. But
I wonder where I work.
I know. But the way the officers approach it in Scotland, they don't have guns. So how is it that they're doing it and not getting hurt, not getting injured, and not taking the life of the person that they're dealing with as well?
Could it be that we have that you mentioned? I feel there's a trend to de-emphasize any police use of force, which I'm afraid by not resolving situations leads to more use of lethal force. You try a taser, it fails, a good chunk of the time, a third of almost half of the time it doesn't work as intended. And then cops reach for their gun. Where is this great success story that we can emulate? We've been talking about reform for decades.
Well, I think that particularly if we're talking about de-escalation, we're talking about mental illness, and we're talking about how officers use force in those situations, I think that it's a greater responsibility than just the police. I think when you start to look at, first of all, it's the delegation of mental illness to police is wholly inappropriate, right? We've got young men and women, we give them a gun, we give them a badge, we give them a ticket book and a pair of handcuffs, and we tell them to go address an issue that a person who spent their entire life with a PhD studying it has yet to be able to figure out how to handle it. But when we look at that approach, it's not necessarily having mental health people driving with cops. That's not even fiscally possible. I think when you start to look at the system as a whole, and even the call takers, how the call is coming in, how is it being given to the officer out in the field, and then when being able to train officers, the key point of what we learned from the UK, when we brought that back to the United States, when we spoke to the ESU members and the SWAT members around the country, these were things that they were doing regularly. So our most trained officers were already utilizing these types of strategies and tactics. But as an industry, we were not arming, and we were not, for lack of a better word, we were not training the people who were responding to this and giving them the same type of tools and the same type of abilities to handle the situation successfully as we do our specialized units.
Let me rephrase a question from Mike. His question is that we live in an era where national politics largely eclipse local politics. And this gets to the question of reforming on a national or state level when, there's something like 17,000 individual police departments in America. The most are incredibly small. But let me add a twist to that as well. And this is something that's made me pessimistic recently because having been involved in this racket for 2 decades now, I've seen things get better incrementally. Working from within, which is not a very sexy way to do things right now. But I'm worried that all that is for naught because now we are demanding perfection because of individual incidents, because of social media, because of what happens somewhere else. I don't know if improvement is good enough anymore, at least politically. How can we reconcile? I mean, there's going to be another bad shooting next month, I guarantee it. If perfection is the goal, we're doomed. So how can we have a system of reform that does improve both substantively policing, but also satisfies the political winds of the time?
Well, maybe I'd say a quick word to that, Peter. I think your question is an excellent one, which is, what is reform trying to achieve? To go back to basics, I think the consensus view in some ways right now is taking a step down from perfection, meaning no shootings of anyone who's unarmed or killings of unarmed civilians, but to go a step, to certainly to reduce that number, although as Scott mentioned earlier, the number of fatalities at the hands of police has held fairly constant. So how much can that be brought down? That would be perhaps one goal. A second goal might be to reestablish, especially in large cities. Again, as you mentioned, this is, again, our politics have become so nationalized, but really where are the issues that reform seems most pertinent is in our large to medium-sized urban environments with large minority communities, and that's particularly their relationship to police. How much policing over traffic stops, small stops on the street, how much is that undermining trust and those sorts of arrests? So that might be another dimension where reestablishing the connection with those communities is a sort of end goal. And many people have sort of alighted on the unions as police unions as an obstacle to this, insofar as the ensemble of job protections they've created through contracts and law has, in a way, shielded, or so the argument goes, a minority of, let's say, bad cops. That is, the amount of most civilian complaints are about a minority of officers, and most violence, stems from those. So if you're not able to remove those officers from the force easily or get them retrained, that's really where the problem is. There's some way to concentrate on that group, which seems to be the problem, and that's, I could say, the consensus view today. I don't know if that helps advance our conversation.
Yeah, I think it does. So the idea of reform is used. Another question that came up from Natalie is asked for Ganesha's views on where politics went off the rails in Baltimore. Can you address, do you have an opinion on that, Ganesha?
I actually do. I really do. And it's one of these things why, sometimes I'm super hopeful, and then some days I'm just like, what can we really do? So I'm going to comment a little bit on what you just asked about the perfection and lead that into the Baltimore answer. There are about 18,000 police departments, I think, across the United States. And while some people are asking for perfection, I also am still working in jurisdictions where I've seen, the N-word used, on video and in text. And so, I think to the last point, that if we treat policing almost like we say we want to treat violence, and figure out how to get those rotten apples out of there, the ones that there's, in Baltimore, 150 complaints in his file, the ones that there's no question when the murder of George Floyd happened, you guys know in policing that there were whispers that said, I knew it. Everybody, I knew it. He was crazy, and he shouldn't have still been on the force, so I think that there is a middle ground, and unfortunately, that's not what we hear in the talking points. Everybody's talking from these different ends of the spectrum. As far as Baltimore goes, I don't know that this happens often in smaller towns, but when you have homicide rates, and that's all anybody talks about, how many bodies have dropped today, and that's obviously very important, particularly for the communities and the families who lose people. But the politicians, it begins again to be, a talking point for election. And you had in Baltimore, I won't name names, but people who would get in front of cameras and talk about community policing and talk about reform, and then behind closed doors say, do whatever you got to do, right, to stop the bodies from dropping. And I won't ask any questions, which is how we got into a consent decree in the first place. And so, there's that tension there. And so that police commissioner was fired because he couldn't stop people from shooting other people. It didn't matter what he was doing around reform. It didn't matter if he was improving community relations. He couldn't stop people from dying. And that's what happens across the country in a lot of jurisdictions. And as we talked about earlier, a lot of people are not going to stop dying until these things that we talked about, these systemic structural issues, are addressed in a real way.
But let me push back a little on that. If you could share the screen I put up, I'd appreciate it. This is about bodies dropping in Baltimore and arrests. And I should mention, this year in most American cities have seen huge, unprecedented increases in shootings and murders. I certainly, policing in Baltimore has always had problems, but it's gotten worse. After 2015, murders, went from 200 to above 300. If the consent decree and the reform movement doesn't address violence, I don't think this is a change for the better. You also see a huge drop in the arrests or the blue bars, the murders, the red line. You also see a huge drop in arrests. Now, that can be good. And if I went back further, if you go back to 2003, you'll see arrests dropping every year. They peaked at 120,000. So there was this improvement, and then a reform commissioner came in. I think did make a lot of change for change's sake. I don't want to get too much into specifics, but abolishing the post system where officers took responsibility for a little geographic area and to.
That was a different, just so you know, Peter, that was a different chief. I'm talking about Kevin Davis and you're talking about Anthony Batts. Just so you know, and that's a conversation we can have offline, by the way.
Yeah.
But I will also say that one thing so we've seen, and you're the smart person, and I do mean that by statistics and all that. I really want an answer for why violence has increased so dramatically in places that had in custody, that's Chicago and Freddie Gray and all that in Baltimore. But here's the difference in Baltimore, and I think this is a big factor. You had a prosecutor that charged police with murder, and she charged folks with murder. Okay. And people watched those police officers' faces get, splayed again across CNN. They were losing their houses. They were, and so I'm not making a comment one way or the other on, whether there were issues there. Right. But murder. And so I think you had a lot of police in Baltimore saying, and their families saying, watch yourself. And that decision became a very different. So I'm not saying that the consent decree didn't play into people's minds, but I would say that watching police officers prosecuted for murder for over a year by our state's attorney was a significant factor in both people feeling more bold to use their guns and to also for police to be hesitant to be as proactive.
Yeah, and the state's attorney in that case never proved. Won no convictions and never actually showed a crime. It was a bizarre trial, to say the least. But I think you're right that it was a real turning point because, quite frankly, and this often it gets linked to police pulling back. Cops said, "Oh, if you don't want us to clear drug corners, we won't." They got the message. The question is whether that was a good message.
Peter, if I may respond to your initial question about optimism versus pessimism, one possible evidence for optimism could be the experience of addressing corruption in the NYPD over a very long period of time. As you may be aware, the New York City Police Department had a reputation as being just incredibly corrupt, way before Serpico, going back really over a century. It was always corrupt. And there used to be this really citywide scandal that shook the news about every generation. They'd say it happened about 30 years. In the late 80s, as a result of a commission that Mayor Dinkins put in place, led by Ray Kelly, that cycle seems to have been broken. Yes, NYPD, other police departments still have corruption scandals, but people without a sense of the history really have no understanding of how bad it used to be. We have a wide-ranging debate over police reform, but generations ago, their debate was only about corruption. And that is a problem that we seem to have gotten our arms around and have addressed. And in that respect, at least, the history can be useful to keep in mind.
It is that things have gotten better. I should also give Baltimore some credit. It is one of the cities this year that has not seen an increase in shootings and murders. So hopefully that's the start of a good trend there. I also want to remind the audience that you can submit questions via the on-screen prompt. But you just raised a very good point about how much progress has been made, not only in corruption in the NYPD over the past decades, but back in the 70s in New York, cops used to shoot literally hundreds of people a year. Last year, I think it was 12. Over decades, unfortunately, we always have a problem with data. If people, I do like giving a plug for the Fatal Encounters website, because it is better than the Washington Post for people interested in police use of lethal force. Fatal Encounters is good for the stat nerds out there. But we have seen decreasing in all the cities that you can get data for. We've seen cops use less force, and I'm talking decades here. But there is reason for optimism in this. We brought down violent crime in the 90s and the 2000s. I'm just worried we're moving in the wrong direction now. Can someone else give me some hope for the future?
Well, Peter, I don't think that, look, you're right that progress has been made in many regards with the reduction of crime. And particularly if you came on up the police in the early 90s like I did, and being behind the scenes then and being behind the scenes today, although the national narrative seems to be much worse about police today, it's far better than what it was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And the caliber of the officer that I feel is much better today, which is also a caveat for defunding, because if you start to cut resources from organizations, these are the people you're going to lose. These are the people that are the lifeblood to the organization. When we had our layoffs, we lost everybody with 14 years or less. And, we're having trouble nationally attracting good people, the type of people the community wants. We're having difficulties getting those people to come to be police officers because of the narrative that is out there. But I don't think that, and I don't think anybody said this here, but I don't want there to be a notion that, police have to be be given free rein to be able to reduce crime. And I don't think anybody that's proven to be effective anywhere. In fact, I think it's just been the opposite, is that the ends don't justify the means, and that short-term gains, it can really put you on the wrong side of the statistics in the long run, because they'll end up polarizing the community. I think that we have technologies today.
On the flip side, isn't there also a tendency never to give police credit when they actually effectively use, legitimate, moral, constitutional, and legal tactics to bring down crime? And then people just say, well, it must be because, we got rid of lead gas in the 70s.
Well, look, for better or for worse, or right or wrong, I think that's just the expectation. I think people expect us to do our jobs. I don't know if I necessarily disagree with a lot of that. I think that, look, we come into this job knowing that there's inherent risks. It's an extremely challenging career. And what doesn't help, getting back to one of the earlier things, is when we do have an incident, is that there is a political reaction for a utopian outcome. And, defunding the police is not the answer. We need police because we have a society that has really bad people that need to be intersected by somebody when they pull out a gun and start doing really bad things, whether that's, beating spouses, molesting children, pulling out a gun and shooting up a neighborhood. Somebody has got to go at 3:00 in the morning and intersect that individual. And so long as we have that, and we are going to always have that, we need to invest in those folks. We need to give them the tools, the technology, and the experiences so that they can be successful in resolving those issues.
We don't have much time left, so maybe I'd like to hear from each of you. Maybe I'll start with Daniel. The question is there some reform, sort of lower hanging fruit, something that is feasible, that could be done, that would make things better?
Well, it's a tough question. I mean, what we've seen is a vast majority of the states have passed new laws in the wake of George Floyd's killing. You could say kind of tackling what they see as sort of the low-hanging fruit, and you can look at what's been already enacted, meaning basically clamping down on certain police tactics like the use of chokeholds, the expansion of the use of body cameras in places that hadn't used them previously or hadn't deployed them very much. But really, most of that's really low, as you suggested, low-hanging fruit. In my view, there isn't much low-hanging fruit to be picked, especially in bigger places, as you mentioned, like New York. You already have the police are not very violent. There's, for the size of the city, for the size of the police force, it's not clear that there's some easy reform that could easily improve the performance of the NYPD, which is a very professional police department.
But that to me is a form of low-hanging fruit, because why not take some of the departments that do better and apply those lessons, figure out what those lessons are, of course, and that's the hard part, but apply them to departments that do something worse. There is such a divergence of measurable behavior in terms of complaints, arrests, use of force among different police departments. The police departments that shoot a lot of people are all out west. They're medium-sized cities like Albuquerque and Tulsa and Bakersfield. Why don't we, I mean, I don't know if we have the answer to this, but why can't we take best practices and apply them to other departments? And maybe Ganesha, maybe is that a role of a consent? Do consent decrees play into that? I mean, Police Executive Research Forum tries to spread certain practices, but that gets a lot of pushback. How can we improve the good?
Yeah, so I think part of the issue is, and I just hate to say this, but so much of this comes down to leadership. I mean, I've seen, departments that people counted down to have a person that comes in and can really push, reform. There's pros and cons to consent decrees, right? So the pros for the consent decree is I was begging for money for technology and for training and for all those things for years, and I didn't get it until the consent decree came. And just in Baltimore not too long ago, Judge Berdar, the federal judge over the consent decree, said, I hear what everybody's talking about, but there's no defunding of this police department under this consent decree. And so those forced investments that people do not, politicians, and sometimes community do not want to give to police departments. I think the consent decree is helpful. One thing, I don't know if this is easy or not, but one thing that I've been thinking about is, it's been in the news too, this duty to intervene. And I think that there's something there, but on the flip side of it, we've got to look out, and protect for those ones who actually do intervene. Make sure they don't get bussed down to the midnight shift, or demoted, or they drop a 13 and no backup comes. Somebody mentioned, doing it from the inside, and I think there's a lot to be said for that. And so the other thing that I would say, and this is super hard, it sounds easy, but it's super hard, is communication. And it's just a cultural thing, and I don't mean this in a bad way. But, police just say, I do what I do and I get it done, and, don't go and tell everybody about it. But one thing that I have found that just really lowered the temperature so much was that telling the community stuff early and often, when that major incident happens, it's going to probably happen in anybody's jurisdiction. You have a little bit of change in the bank, maybe not dollars, but just some change in the bank to draw down on. And so I think that that's something that if we could really get chiefs comfortable with that communication early and often, I think that would be helpful as well.
Scott, Daniel, building on that, Daniel mentioned leadership. You were in Camden for a long time. How important is the continuity of leadership in the department? And we are running out of time here.
Yeah, in a short answer, for me, it was extremely important. I was the 6th leader in 5 years. And so essentially, organizationally, there was a very strong current that people existed in. And that current was dictated by labor, by the union. They were more powerful than any police leader. They were more powerful and more influential than any elected leader. And part of the charge that I had when I became chief was to change the flow of that water and to put it in a new direction. It's not easy. It is, it's not just a culture. I mean, a policy exercise, because we know that culture eats policy for breakfast. So it's not just a unilateral police chief or police department effort. It needs political support. It needs support of the people that are, the other agencies, the schools and the like, to help be able to facilitate that change.
Thanks. We are out of time. Stephen, do you have any
Just
Pearl
really
the
quickly, quick reform. I'd like to see more application of concept. Police reform is about accountability. Let's talk about accountability for other service systems as well. When the number of mentally ill people in jail goes up, when a mentally ill person gets shot, what service provider gets their contract cut? What official is forced to resign? When does that ever happen? Until we see that type of accountability for other service systems, then shifting these resources to upstream alternatives is not going to get us anywhere. And hopefully that's where we're going with this accountability debate.
Thank you, everyone. This has been the best hour I've heard police discussion in a while. I'm going to turn this back over to Hannah, who's going to say some closing remarks. But really, thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much to our moderator and our panelists. What an incredible, meaty discussion about police reform, and so helpful for all of us thinking about what to advocate for and how to have these discussions to move toward positive change. Before we close, and using my Micro Machine Man speed, I would like to invite our public audience to sign up on our website to receive updates from the Policing and Public Safety Initiative, including information about upcoming events. This Thursday, October 15th, we have an exciting panel entitled Policing While Black, focusing on the perspectives of Black police executives. And for that, we are lucky to have former Baltimore PD Acting Commissioner Anthony Barksdale, former NYPD Chief of Housing James Secreto, and groundbreaking CUNY Graduate Center Professor and Director Michael J. Fortner. And as our moderator, Manhattan Institute Senior Fellow Coleman Hughes. It should be very exciting this Thursday. On our website, you can also browse the Manhattan Institute's research and subscribe to our newsletters. And if you are able, please do consider supporting the Institute at the link you see below. MI is a nonprofit organization, and our work depends on support from people like you. Thank you so much, panelists and watchers, for such a fantastic event.